Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. And from the outset, may I say that I'm very pessimistic about the European opportunities, and I'll spell out why. I like to focus my short introduction on trust building, a way to peace and stability, question mark. And there are, of course, many different building blocks to create the favorable conditions needed for dialogue and diplomacy, and in the end, peace and security on the peninsula. And there are many different trust-building methods, and I would like to share some thoughts on the exchange programs we have at our institute and been conducted over several years, but also some other trust-building methods I have personal experience from. So starting with the ISDP program and our experience, for a little bit more than 10 years, we have had an exchange program with North Korea, built on North Korean guest researchers coming to our institute in Stockholm, and our staff being able to travel to North Korea and engage in discussions with officials and visits parts of the country, not only Pyongyang, but of course, with all the normal travel restrictions applied to visitors to North Korea. Guest researchers coming to Sweden need a visa from our government, so political decisions for these types of engagement are necessary and a precondition. Until the pandemic, we normally had guest researchers coming for 2 to 3 times a year. They came in groups of 2, never alone, and we always tried to, in parallel, have guest researchers from South Korea at the Institute, trying to pair the two, doing joint research, but at least sharing and discussing each other's work. And if possible, we always try to have semi-public events where the researcher can present his or her work as normal academic practice. But during or after the outbreak of the pandemic in early 2020, we have had no guest researchers at the institute, and we have not been able to travel to North Korea, as most other institutes engaged in North Korea-related activities. We have had guest researchers from South Korea and other nations, but none from DPRK. But as we heard in the introduction video, we have received information from our North Korean contacts, both the embassy here in Stockholm and others in Pyongyang, that they have expressed an interest to resume both of these programs, but nothing concrete so far. I would also like to mention, just so we don't forget that when we talk about trust building, that part of the things I did when I was in South Korea, I think could be put in the category of trust building. That is the implementation of the Armistice Agreement through the Military Armistice Commission and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, and also the Comprehensive Military Agreement that contains several provisions for increased transparency, risk reduction, and trust building. And I can specifically mention disarming of the soldiers in the joint security area and demining of the joint security area. But the CMA failed to have an independent implementation mechanism. And a third example of these trust-building activities where I've had personal experience is, of course, the many different multilateral dialogues, both informal and official, being organized by our institute and others with different representations and formats. But to my knowledge, none of those have been with North Korean participants since early 2020. Overall, I believe these types of trust-building activities are of primary medium to long-term value. It is by gradually building a relation or developing an understanding of our opponent that these activities can be of importance. Doing one trip to Pyongyang is of little value, but doing 20 trips over several years can be. But that's what we have been doing. Maybe more important for our discussion today is looking forward. So what can we do and what need to be done? And in short, as I said in the opening, I'm very pessimistic at the moment. Exchange and contacts with North Korea are more needed than ever because of geopolitical developments. but the prospects look to me very, very dim. Why is that? I have four major factors. First, the current geopolitical changes, and especially the last meeting, the meeting last week between President Putin and Kim Jong-un, and I quote, an agreement to automatic military intervention in times of crisis. That for me, with my military background, will cause nervousness and serious complexity and challenges in the operational planning in the joint US-South Korean alliance. But it will also put a strain on the whole region, anticipating how much and what this new agreement will include. My second factor is the continued development of North Korea's nuclear arsenal, with a new mix of long and medium-range missiles, new mobile launchers, possible underwater launch capability, the introduction of tactical nuclear weapons, and improved command and control through satellite capability. My third factor, North Korea's new policy on unification, or rather, having declared South Korea as its principal enemy. And lastly, the pandemic, and several years of isolation more than ever, having learned North Korea to manage with very, very limited external support and direct personal contacts. We, the outside world, and especially Europe, have lost what little fidelity and personal contact we had before the pandemic. When I put these factors together, I would like to draw four main conclusions. One, the risk of unintended incidents have increased, and we can see signs of this with provocations over balloons, reintroduction of loudspeaker operations, more activities and construction work in the DMZ, including cases where warning shots already have been fired. Two, the ongoing arms race in the region will continue, and North Korea are likely to benefit from Russian technical support to further improve its military capability, adding additional risks to misunderstanding and provocations. Three, North Korea is not under any time pressure to engage in dialogue, and we may need them more than they need us. The political cost for engaging North Korea have increased. And fourth, returning to Europe, Europe having traditionally been a facilitator and moderator in relation to North Korea, and through the Helsinki peace process and other, we have an extensive experience of trust building. But for now, in my judgment, it seems to be that Europe is sidelined in North Korea's foreign policy, or at least we have been losing some of our influence. With this, I hope I have provided some figures and facts and aspects of interest, and would be happy to continue the conversation on what can Europe do to change the calculus in Pyongyang so that they are ready to re-engage with us. Thank you.
Mats Engman, thank you so much for that. Could I just clarify on your pessimism point here? You've laid out the continuing intransigence of the DPRK, but into that pessimism, could you give a balance of the lack of weight or the sidelining of Europe? How much does that weigh into your pessimism? And the polarization containment policy of the US, which I think, as we all know here, Europe is not quite as set in its vision and values as the US on that.
What I see, both with doing the work I've been doing with North Korea and the region, is that, first of all, North Korea has new friends, which make them less dependent on the kind of support that we can provide. They are not in that kind of desperate need for economic revival, because of its relation with not only Russia, but I would also point to Iran and some others, maybe Brazil, Venezuela, to mention a few. So that's one. So they are not in a disparate state. And the key actor that can maybe open the door for re-engagement and make an impact in decision-making in Pyongyang is China.
Right.
And because of the current geopolitical stalemate between United States and China, and also Europe's, let's say, cautiousness in reaching out to China, I don't see that happening. And the price that China will ask for any kind of, accepting the role of being driving North Korea would be very high. I just this morning had a debate on Taiwan, and that could be one of the prices we had to pay, or the United States have to pay for having Beijing play ball with us.
That is an incredibly pessimistic, I might say, and an interesting point there. But you mentioned China, and Vladimir Putin was last week, I think, in there, and then he went from there to Vietnam. So to what extent are we seeing a reorganization that is threatening to us in Europe? Say, because you mentioned Russia, Iran, Brazil, Venezuela, and then the US calls Vietnam a like-minded partner in balancing the expansion of China. Could you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, what I sense is in the making is a bit of a, call it partnership security architecture in East Asia, where you have one bloc centered around the liberal democracy values and market economy, rule of law, championed by United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea. And then you have the authoritarian bloc, centered around China and Russia, with also nations like North Korea, Iran, and others joining, or at least tacitly supporting. So we have this kind of, it's not a Cold War, I wouldn't say that, because the Cold War was existential. This is not in the same category, but we have a situation where we have this kind of two blocks standing, and it's not that I see an immediate military threat, but I do see, as I have firsthand experience of these kind of unintended incident and risks and escalation, and I'm the first to recognize that we badly need dialogue and diplomacy, but currently I don't see that North Korea would accept that. And the terms for accepting would be very, very difficult. And one such term would be not to include denuclearization on the talks and the agenda.
So this is interesting, because we've got these two blocks, but also have Russia and China worked out how they are going to carve up their influence, particularly in North Korea, or was China completely briefed before Vladimir Putin went there on what they were going to sign up to?
I don't think they are in harmony and total agreement. There are still a lot of issues where there could be frictions in the Russia-China relationship. But I remember a quote that I read many times, many years ago, when we saw this starting to build, that said something in, if I remember it correctly, maybe not always in agreement, but never against.
Right.
To characterize the Moscow-Beijing relationship. And I think there are so many complementing factors that make these two staying the course. And I don't think it will be over, even if we manage to get to a conclusion of the war in Ukraine. I think it's much more strategic, much more long-term, but it's not without frictions.
And of course, I mean, the more this polarization solidifies, the less possibility Europe has of putting out the olive branches that perhaps the US wouldn't, because the camps are being made more concrete. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that one possible, glimpse, a light in the tunnel, if I may, would be a reawakening in Europe that Korean security is also a matter for Europe, because now the threat of North Korea has come to Europe through its support to Russia. So maybe that would make politicians in Europe realize they need to put more effort into East Asian security and be ready to let's develop. First of all, I think the most important thing Europe could do in the short term is to develop a coordinated Europe policy on North Korea issues, and not allow North Korea to play different European nations against each other when it comes to, for instance, opening of embassies.
Thank you very much for that. I want to move on though. We also need a coordinated China policy, and before that, a coordinated Russia policy. So there is a lot of that going on. Stay with us.